Good afternoon, everyone. Well, good morning in Europe. My name is Scott Persner, and I am the Director of International Affairs for the Taiwan Wild Bird Federation. And so on behalf of the TWBF and our partners, the Taiwan Endemic Species Research Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to the third webinar in our 2021 Major Topics in International Bird Conservation webinar series. This is based off of the 2020 publication of the State of Taiwan Birds Report, Taiwan's first national bird report. And so actually one of the major topics which was covered in the SOTB was monitoring of bird species. We have topics such as monitoring of breeding birds, of migratory birds, migratory raptors, and even certain species such as fairy pitta, pheasant-tailed jacanas, and others. And so our speaker today, we're very lucky to be able to have our speaker today, is going to discuss with us bird monitoring in Czechia as well as in Europe. And so a little bit more about our speaker. Dr. Petr Vorisek from the Czech Society of Ornithology has a PhD in zoology from Charles University in Prague, Czechia, and has been working for the CSO since 1996. He has held various positions, including director and coordinator of the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Scheme, and has also been involved in the European coordination of the second European Breeding Bird Atlas. He has co-authored scientific papers and other publications on bird monitoring data, and has been active in local bird monitoring studies and is interested in the history of ornithology. During today's talk, he will share with us his experiences from coordinating two large-scale projects, the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Scheme and the second European Breeding Bird Atlas. He will also describe how his team organizes bird monitoring in diverse European conditions, and will show the results, explaining for us how they contribute to nature conservation and policy at the national and international level. Before I hand over the floor to Peter, I just want to let you know that if you have any questions for our speaker, please put them in the question and answer box, and we will bring them up and ask them to our guest speaker at the end during the question and answer session. And so it is with that, I will hand over the floor now to Peter. So take it away, and please share your screen.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Scott, for introducing me, and thanks a lot for inviting me to have the opportunity to share some of our experience from monitoring in Europe. So just share the screen. I just need to go to the very beginning. Yeah. Can you see the screen? Can you see the presentation, just to check?
Everything
Not
okay? Yet. Have you pressed the share screen button at the bottom there?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah. Sorry, there was one click I missed. Okay, so in my talk, I'm going to present approaches, results, and challenges we've been facing in organizing large-scale bird monitoring in Europe. I'm speaking on behalf of two organizations, the CSO, Czech Society of Ornithology, which is my sort of mother organization. I've been working since '96, and the European Breeding Bird Census, European Bird Census Council. I will give a bit more information about both organizations a bit later. Just before I start about talking about the projects, that's perhaps good to realize how many bird species we have in Europe. To compare to other continents, the bird species diversity is not so big. We have some more than 50. I don't put the exact number here. Of course, we know the exact number, but the issue here is that there are different taxonomies of the bird species, and sometimes there are different understandings of what Europe is, in fact. So officially, for example, BirdLife figure for Europe is, I think, 544 species. But in the European Breeding Bird Atlas, you will see the number a bit higher. And that's mostly because in the European Breeding Bird Atlas, we included also the whole territory of Turkey. And Turkey, as you know, is partly in Europe, partly in Asia. But because of the practical reasons, we included Turkey as well. So these are these differences. But anyway, we don't have so many bird species in Europe, for example, to compare to Asia. Nevertheless, the diversity of the habitats in Europe is quite high. So we have almost everything, I think, except of tropical rainforests. We don't have a tropical zone in Europe, but otherwise you can find basically all types of the habitats. And you can find also all types of the cultures and the languages and the standards. Well, the picture above, it's really taken at one of the EBCC board meetings when we struggle with different standards of the electricity plugins to charge our laptops, and this illustrates the diversity in Europe we have, and which we have sometimes to struggle with, because even the languages. Well, the picture here is a translation of the title of the second European Breeding Bird Atlas into the European languages we just were able to collect. This is definitely not a complete list of the European languages, but that illustrates one of the challenges we have, and I will speak a little bit about how we faced and how we cope with that challenges. So today I'm going to speak mostly about the two main projects: the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Schemes, we call it PEBMS, and the second European Breeding Bird Atlas, EBA2, and very, very little about the third main initiative under the EBCC, which is the Eurobird Portal, EBP. First, I think it's worth of describing what the EBCC is. It's a basically NGO. It's an association under the Dutch law, and that association is it's consisted of experts, ornithologists, experts in the bird monitoring and atlasing. In principle, EBCC doesn't have any staff. It's based on completely on voluntary base. The most of the job is done by the board members or the specific task force, task groups, working groups. And in cases of the projects like European Breeding Bird Atlas or PEBMS, the work is usually delegated to the partner organizations like the CSO. And the CSO, which is the partner organization for the EBCC projects, is a kind of typical NGO focused on the bird research and bird conservation. So both we do research and conservation. It's a membership-based organization, and the CSO is a partner of the BirdLife International for the Czech Republic. So that's very briefly about these two main partners who play the key role in the projects I'm going to talk about. So in fact, the CSO is a hosting organization for some of the positions of these two main EBCC projects, the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring and the European Breeding Bird Atlas. So formally, me and my colleagues who work on these international monitoring projects, formally we are part of the staff of the CSO, so we are in the normal structure of the organization, but there is a EBCC board and potentially also the steering groups on the different projects who oversee how we work and whether we perform well. So that's the standard way of managing the projects. Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Schemes, the first project I'm going to talk about is the project which has been established in 2002, so nearly 20 years ago, as a joint initiative of the EBCC and BirdLife International. And the main goal of the project has been to use birds as the indicators of the environment and the nature, using the scientific data on bird population across Europe. And I said already that this project is run from the CSO office in Prague. We've got especially in very initial phases, we've got the financial support from the RSPB, the UK partner of the BirdLife. And then more and more, we've got the support from the European Commission, which is the main kind of government of the European Union. But we get some other financial support and contributions from other different partners. And technically, we benefit from the expertise not only in the CSO, but also in other partner organizations like British Trust for Ornithology, SOVON, Dutch Center for Field Ornithology, European Environment Agency, and particularly Statistics Netherlands, which is the official bureau of the statistics of the Netherlands, which has a dedicated wildlife statistics unit, and they provide really the best expertise on the statistics, on the ways how to analyze the data, how to calculate the population indices, and so on. And they provide also the software as well. So that's very key element of the work in the project. In principle, we have few tens of national monitoring schemes in Europe, let's say common bird monitoring schemes in Europe, and all these schemes are organized at the national level, and some of them existed even before PEBMS was established. So, and that's how the Europe works. Everybody does its own business, but there are some common standards. So the common standards in this way is that these national monitoring schemes use the standardized methods. It could be line transect, like as illustrated on the left-hand bottom, or point counts or territory mapping. So basically these three main type of methods to count birds are used. They use the representative sampling, but the sampling is also usually different country by country according to the conditions of the countries. And in vast majority of cases, the field work is done by the volunteers. So these have been skilled volunteers, because majority of the detection of birds is based on sound recording, on sound by hearing. So these people have to be really very skilled to do the bird counts. And what's important, as I said, we use the data from the nationally organized monitoring schemes, and they are different in some ways, but keeping the common standard. And what we know, it would be quite difficult to get all the raw data from each monitoring scheme and to produce, for example, the European population index for individual species. That would be a big challenge. Nowadays, when all these online tools and databases, that would be much easier than 20 years ago. But still, there is a big issue of the sensitivity of the data, sensitivity of the raw data. So our approach is that we are not using the raw data for calculating the European index, but we use the national indices, which the countries produce anyway. They just have to produce them in the standardized way, in the prescribed form. And using the expertise and using the software from the developed in Statistics Netherlands, we combine the national indices together to produce the European index. So that's the key element of being successful in the monitoring in such a diverse country with different approaches. So simply we don't use the raw data, but we combine the national indices. And this is how the results look like for nearly 170 species. We produce the European population index. That's the relative index of changes in the abundance. We set the base year to 1980, where we have some reasonable data from some countries in Europe. And then in percent, it shows the changes, the population changes. So on the left-hand graph, we see two species of tree creepers, how their populations have developed over the last nearly 40 years. And this is what we can produce and what we produce every year on an annual basis for those nearly 170 species for Europe. The results are available on the website, and today we've made them also open access available, so people can download the European index and can work with them. While there are also some other accompanying information like the long-term trend and standard errors and so on. And the next kind of main product which we produce on the annual basis is a multi-species index, which we call indicator. And this is the main policy relevant output from the PEBMS, which shows for the certain groups of the species, like here on the right-hand graph, the common farmland species and common forest species and all common species is the index how the population of these groups of the species characteristic for kind of habitat is doing. So we see that the farmland birds are doing quite badly, the forest birds are something more or less okay, and the all common species is something in between. And this is the main tool we've been using as a to inform the policy about the state of the European common birds. And a part of the policy, which I'm going to talk a bit more later, a part of the policy, the PEBMS outputs have been widely used in the scientific papers. There are more than 30 papers published so far based on the PEBMS data, PEBMS outputs. I've just selected two examples that, thanks to this large-scale monitoring outputs, we have good information about the effect of the climate change, for example, on the common birds in Europe and North America. In this case, we combine the data from Europe also with the data from North America. And we've been able to show that the population trends of the species, which are, let's say, expected to be positively affected by the climate change, are already increasing, and the population trends of the species which are expected to be negatively affected by climate change are already declining. So that's confirmation of the impact of the climate change on common bird species. And the other example is very recent. We just published 2 weeks ago, we've published a paper also combining the data from Europe and North America, which is based on reconstructing soundscapes of birds using the monitoring data and using the citizen science sound recordings in Xenocanto portal. And these reconstructions of the soundscapes shows that the bird songs in Europe and in the North America are becoming less diverse and quieter, which may have consequences for the human well-being and for the connectedness of the people with the nature. And we have some much more information-based scientific papers and information based on the PEBMS, on the large-scale monitoring data. And one of them is this information published some years ago in Ecology Letters, showing that really the common birds in Europe are in troubles, because in absolute numbers they are declining, and they are declining in the biomass, although there is some increase in the recent years. But this shows another sort of the problem for the nature conservation, because until relatively recently, we've been focused in the nature conservation on threatened and rare species, and somehow we've been ignoring a little bit what's going on with the common species. But the common species, they are really shaping the ecosystems, and they are key for functioning of the ecosystems. And thanks to the PEBMS data, we've been able to show that the common species are in troubles. We are losing them. Of course, there are still plenty of them around us, but to compare to the situation 20, 30 years ago, it's much less. So that's the point which I think changed a little bit also the understanding of the nature conservation community, that not only threatened and rare species are important, but also the common species. I think it's reflected also in the global BirdLife goals to keep common birds common. That was not among the goals some decades ago of the BirdLife. So this is at least partly output of the initiatives like PEBMS. And what we've been able to show using the PEBMS is that the farmland bird species are in decline. We've lost half of the farmland birds, not the species, but half of the farmland birds in Europe, as the indicator shows. The indicator is that right hand. And there is a good scientific evidence from other sources that the main driving force of this huge decline of the farmland birds is the intensification of the agriculture. We can see that the productivity or the production is increasing. The production of agriculture is increasing since 1980s in Europe. And the agriculture intensification has many phases. It's just a high crop production. It's a high pesticide use, fertilizers. Basically, it's a loss of the heterogeneity in the farmland. So we have a troubles in the farmland, and it's not only birds. The birds are just the top of the iceberg. There are some information on butterflies, for example. The butterfly specialists have developed a similar type of the indicator. It's showing even the worst picture of the European farmland and other taxa as well. So the farmland bird indicator has been the main tool showing to the policy that we have troubles. We have troubles with the farmland, especially with the farmland, with the biodiversity in farmland. And the farmland bird indicator has been formally accepted as an official indicator of biodiversity at the level of the European Union, and then also in many individual member states, in many countries in Europe. So nowadays, when you look at the web page of the Eurostat, the official Bureau of the Statistics of the European Union, you find the farmland bird indicator produced by NGOs as one of the few biodiversity indicators used in the official statistics of the Eurostat. And the indicators and the species population trends have been used in making the European Red List and other policy reports. So nowadays, the products of the PEBMS have been quite widely used and accepted. And when we talk time to time to the policy people, especially at the European Union level, we realize all the time that they hardly can imagine the situation not having this farmland bird index as an indicator of the biodiversity. So that's quite big success. Of course, the question is, we inform the policy the problem is there, but the problem persists. So far, when we produce the farmland bird indicator on the annual basis, every year we see some small step down and down in the values of the indicator. So situation is not going to change, at least in the very near future, but there are some positive signs. We've been in contact with the European Commission about the targets of a quite ambitious new nature restoration law, which is on the way in the European Union. So we may see that the targets will include also the levels of the farmland bird indicator to be increased, and that potentially can be obligatory for the member states. So perhaps there is some light at the end of the tunnel of the negative situation of the farmland birds. And why I'm talking quite a lot about the European Union and the European Commission, and that's because, especially in case of the farmland birds and the farmland biodiversity, we know that that agriculture intensification is driven by so-called EU Common Agriculture Policy. That's the big policy which takes like 40% of the European budget. Basically, these are the subsidies going to the farmers in Europe. The problem is not the subsidies itself. The problem is that the subsidies are set up in a way that they support the intensification and the ways of the farmland management, which is destructive for the nature. And we can see the effect of entering the EU at the example of the Czech Republic, and using the common bird monitoring data in Czech Republic. We've been able to show that after Czech Republic entered the EU in 2004, the agriculture intensification increased. That's that left-hand graph that increased quite significantly. And at the same time, the population trends of common farmland species, they declined. So, and there are some other, there is some other evidence. This is correlation, of course, but there is some other evidence that really this is the issue. So we need to focus on the common agriculture policy to be changed in the way that it subsidizes not harmful activities for the nature, and it should be should make the agriculture sustainable. And that's another step we are considering in PEBMS, not just to provide the information to the policymakers, not just to provide the information there is something wrong or good going in the nature, but helping them to adjust the policy tools, because there are many ways how even recent policy tools in Europe are trying to help the nature. So we see that the agriculture intensification has a negative effect on the trends of the common farmland birds. That's that left-hand graph. But we have in Europe we have a birds directive, which is kind of international law obligatory for all EU member states, which protects some species and which makes obligatory for the member states to develop the protected areas for the selected species. And these are SPA, special protected areas. And we see that with increasing proportion of the farmland declared as the SPAs, the population trends of the common farmland birds are, let's say, less negative. Still, the difference is not so big, but there is some positive effect of EU nature protection law. And the same is with the proportion of the Natura 2000 sites. Basically, Natura 2000 sites are the SPAs plus other protected areas according to the different nature conservation law. And we see that the farmland birds are declining in both in nature protected areas and outside, but the position of the birds in the protected areas is much better. Just the rate of the decline is quite same. So this sends a signal to the policy people that the nature conservation law, then the legislation can help, but probably it's not enough, or perhaps it's not implemented properly. That's another question. But there is a big potential even in the existing nature conservation law we have in Europe, but it should be used in a better way. So this is to illustrate that in PEBMS we are shifting a little bit our consideration from solely information provider to advisor, trying to help the policy to find the best ways how to solve the problems with the conservation of birds, in this case of the farmland birds, but it's not only about the farmland birds. So I'm slowly getting to the next project. So far, I've been talking about the population trends and the counts and the monitoring of changes in time. But in parallel to the monitoring of population changes, to the monitoring of changes of abundance, we need the information about the distribution of birds. And in Europe, we have already excellent, great piece of work done by our colleagues in 1980s, which is the first European breeding bird atlas, EBA1. The atlas was published in 1997, and that was really a milestone in the European ornithology. It's been cited in more than 3,000 scientific papers. The data have been used in the papers. The data have been used in the assessing of conservation status of the species and in many single species studies and so on. But the problem is that it's quite old. The data was collected mostly in 1980s, and especially the big issue with the first European atlas is that at that time the waste areas in the east of the Europe were not covered. Were either covered very poorly or not covered at all, not covered by the fieldwork. So, and that was mostly the European part of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and some other countries in East and Southeast. So, in like 15 years ago, more or less, the idea of running second European atlas just started among the community of the EBCC people. And the reasons behind this thinking were quite obvious. The European landscape quite changed quite a lot over the last 30 years. We've seen the intensification of the agriculture. I've been talking quite a lot about the intensification. We've seen the climate change already affecting the birds and other, and we've seen that the annual temperatures are really increasing in Europe as well. But in parallel with the changes in the landscape, in the changes in the climate, there've been changes also in the expertise and, let's say, technology of bird monitoring, because first European Atlas was done in the standardized way, and the main product was basically presence, absence, and abundance per squares in the grid of the squares, 50 by 50 kilometers across the continent. But in the meantime, the techniques to model the probability of the distribution at finer scale have been developed in Europe. Here, this is the example of one of the regions with the region Atlas in Spain, Catalonia, who's been pioneering this type of the work. And the technology in statistics now allows to make much detailed maps of the probabilities of bird species in bigger area. So that was another element contributing to the consideration for the second European Breeding Bird Atlas. And I said already that in the first European Atlas, we didn't have cover waste areas in the east, especially European part of Russia, which is 40% of the surface of the continent. And when we've heard from our colleagues, Mikhail Kalyakin and Olga Volcit from Russia, that they are considering to organize Atlas of the European Russia, that was another great trigger for serious consideration to make the European Atlas, because with the help of the Russian colleagues, that we could really make the European Atlas to cover the whole Europe. We could make it happen. So in 2010, we had the EBCC conference in Cáceres in Spain, and we discussed the idea of organizing new European breeding bird atlas. The people were quite enthusiastic, and I just remember when the issue was discussed, some of the delegates just passed on the piece of paper with written, "Just do it." So we've taken it seriously, and we started organizing the atlas. I think it's important to describe how we organize the European Atlas in this diverse environment in Europe. So first, the EBCC board selected the so-called Atlas Steering Committee, basically the board of the elected people who kind of would oversee the whole project. But that was obvious from the very beginning that the coordination work needs professional input. And soon it was decided that there will be three institutions who will be hosting the coordination. That was the Swiss Ornithological Institute in Switzerland, CSO in Prague in Czechia, and Catalan Ornithological Institute in Barcelona in Spain. So the coordination was done not from one center, but from three centers, but we've worked together. And well, this is just the opportunity to show the names of the teams in all these three main coordination institutions, and to acknowledge the contribution of all these people. It doesn't mean that everybody worked full time for that. That's usually that was combined and part time and so on. So the capacity was not so big allocated to the coordination. Nevertheless, we managed to work together from these three countries, and I think that was good experience, because each of these institutions with different backgrounds, different expertise, and also perhaps different cultural backgrounds and different understandings of what's happening in different parts of Europe, what they brought together was really the key element for the success of the project. But we hardly would achieve making the European Atlas happen without the coordinators in individual European countries. So we didn't coordinate the field work from the center. That was the task for the national coordinators. And because of the PEBMS, we had already contacts in all European countries. So we had the contacts on the experts. So that was not so difficult to establish the network of the national coordinators. So in each country, we had at least one coordinator. In many countries, there were more people or even more institutions involved in the coordination. And the task of organizing the field workers in the countries to keep an eye on the methodology, to collect the data, to check the data for the quality, and submit the data to the center. That were the tasks for the national coordinators. And again, these were another key elements for success of this huge project in this diverse continent as Europe is. And this shows how the work has been done. Everything went to the coordination teams, these 3 coordination teams, and we were supervised by the steering committee. Had some contacts with the special expert groups because there was a lot of statistical modeling for the modeled maps. So we've got the expert group of the best brains of people who had the expertise on the statistical modeling of bird distribution in Europe, and they helped us quite a lot. And in case of the field work, as I said, that was the national coordinators who coordinated the field workers but reported to us. And then when it came to the phase of publishing the book, of course, we've been in contact and cooperated with the publisher. And writing the species accounts, which is the bulk of the book, that required coordination of more than 300 species authors. So we had a system of account editors and the authors, and independently we had also artists contributing. You will see some later on. And this is just showing the whole process. I'm not going to the details. It just shows that the whole process of making the European Atlas is more than 10 years. So we decided in 2010, and we published the book in 2020. But there was a lot of things happening. So we started exploring what are the needs of the national coordinators. We had several workshops, the pilot collection of the data, the final data checks, a lot of modeling. Of course, at the very beginning, we had to prepare the methods and the guidelines. And what's quite important here, it's that the MAVA fieldwork phase, that was 3 years period when we got the funding from Swiss-based MAVA Foundation, which was especially focused on supporting the Eastern European countries, which are not wealthy countries, have less field workers, difficulty with infrastructure and so on. And this funding helped us to support the national coordinators and the field work in those countries in the form of small grants. So simply we've allocated a relatively small amount of money to tens of countries, helping them to do the field work. So the cooperation at all levels was really the element. I hardly can imagine any other project when we had so diverse approaches in methodology, different conditions, sometimes also different political views and different cultures. But the overarching thing was we are making the European Atlas, and that's our aim, and we cooperate. And so we cooperated at the level of the field work, but as well at the level of the data analysis. And that was really the key. Another key was the standardized methods. I've mentioned several times that Europe is diverse. It's diverse in methodological approaches as well, but we had to have a really common standard. So there were some modifications allowed at the country level, but the common standard, which is basically the Atlas breeding codes, showing the probability of breeding of each species in each square, that was necessary. The grid of the squares, of course, that was also necessary to have it. So we've used exactly the same grid which was used in the first European Atlas to be able to compare the outputs. So that standardized methodology was really another key. And then I've mentioned already the support via MAVA Foundation, the small grants. And that support went mostly to the countries in east of the Europe to support their field work. But that support was also done in the way of training in the field methods and understanding. And our way of training was not that the international experts from the EBCC and from the coordination team went to the countries and gave a lecture. That was not the approach our approach we used was that we came to the countries and we did the field work together with the local ornithologists, with the very local ornithologists. So we usually established mixed groups, one person from the coordination team and few people from the local ornithologists, and we really did the Atlas field work together. And that was the best opportunity from our side to explain the details of the methods, and from their side to explain their concerns, and perhaps together we could develop the modifications of the methods which suits each country. And that proved to be also very, very helpful, such a personal contacts and personal doing things together, not just lecturing the people, but doing things together. And that applied also to the data analysis. And we've provided online tools to the countries where they could see the progress, they could see the quality of the data in each square, and they could share it with the, for example, coordinators in neighboring countries, because in many cases we had the squares which were at the borders between between two or even more countries, and the coordinators had to negotiate what's the status of each species in the square and what's the abundance of the species in that shared squares. So these online tools helped quite a lot. And of course, the enthusiasm in the field work of the people. Imagine, the field work in Western Europe is usually not so difficult, but also there are some difficult places like alpine habitats. But imagine the field work in waste areas of Russia when you have to go by helicopter to somewhere. There are no people living there, no streets, no roads, no electricity. So that was really a big challenge, and enthusiasm of the local field workers made it happen. And the enthusiasm was needed also for the ornithologists, perhaps less funny part of the work, which is the computers and the meetings and corrections and the proofs. I just want to mention the enthusiasm of the artists, because for the book we asked the European artists we knew whether they would be keen to contribute their paintings for the book for free. And nearly 50 of them agreed to do that. So they provided their paintings for free for the Atlas. But that's not all. Some of them made the exhibitions of their artwork. They sold the paintings, and they shared part of the profit with the Atlas. So they contributed in the many ways. So that enthusiasm in all levels is also very, very key. I said that we managed to have countries in the East covered much better, but still, let's imagine this is big challenge. We had more than 120,000 people contributing with some data, and some 35,000 people doing the systematic field work really for the Atlas, mostly collecting the data to be used in the statistical modeling. But still, there are big differences in the number of ornithologists. In western part of Europe, we easily have 40 observers per 1 square, 50 by 50 kilometers. But in Russia, we have 1 observer per 2 squares. So still, it's a big challenge to compare this. Nevertheless, here is the comparison of the quality of the field data in first European Atlas and in second one. So basically the blue squares are the squares we had the good or acceptable data. These orange squares are the squares with the poor data quality, and these gray are without no data. So it's a big achievement to compare to EBA1, even despite this disproportional number of field workers in different parts of Europe. Of course, still the quality of the data in eastern parts of the continent sometimes must be considered, but we've considered it in the accompanying text in the atlas. So sometimes you can read in the text accompanying the maps that information about the distribution should be taken with some caution, because maybe field effort was not so heavy as in western part of the Europe, but that happens. So finally, we've managed to publish the big book. It's nearly a year ago when we launched the book, and this is just a quick overview what's in the book. So we have more than 500 full species accounts. Some species are treated just in appendix because they had very rare occurrence or so on. We had nearly 750 kilometer maps showing abundance or breeding evidence. It depends what we are showing at each species level. In more than 200 species, we had data good enough to produce modeled maps of the probability of occurrence at 10 by 10 scale. And we have, that's quite important, we have more than 400 maps of change, the maps of change of the distribution between first atlas and the second atlas. And illustrations, and you see nearly 350 authors contributed writing the species text, and nearly 50 artists provided their illustrations. The book in general consists of the general chapters with the information about how work has been done, the methods, the detailed description of the methods, and some general assessments of the state of the European birds based on the atlas information. Probably for most of the ornithologists, the main thing is the species account. So species by species, you can see the maps of the distribution changes and some text accompanying, helping to interpret the maps, and some appendices, and of course a lot of references. And this is how the typical species account map, pages looks like for the great partridge, for example. So in this typical case, we have a abundance map, the modeled maps of the probability of distribution, and the map of change. I will show some bit more examples soon. So what's the main outputs of the atlas? What we found? So we found that we have nearly 600 species, and this is this is not. You remember at the very beginning I said we had some more than 400 species in Europe. So here I'm saying we have nearly 600 species breeding in Europe, and this is mostly because in the European Atlas we've included Turkey, the Asian part of Turkey as well. So this is good to keep in mind when comparing different figures. What's important, I think, here is that almost every 10th species in Europe nowadays is non-native. So we have some 10% of species breeding in Europe, which are non-native species brought by humans from different parts of the globe, and they established their populations and they breed, and usually they spread in Europe nowadays. Out of these native species, some 99 of them are either endemics for Europe or near endemic. So the majority of their populations, or all their populations, are only in Europe. So this level of endemism is not so big, again, to compare to Asia, for example, or Central South America. But again, for the European conservationists, it's important to know what's the level of endemism and what's our responsibility towards the global priorities of the species. And we can compare the distribution of each species with the others. And at one side of the extreme, we have very, very common widespread species like this white wagtail, which occurred in 91% of squares. So in principle, everywhere in Europe, you can see the white wagtail, or nearly everywhere. On the other side of of the extreme, we have this Azor bullfinch, which is confined to 150 by 50 square in the Atlantic Islands. So, and there is many cases in between. What's quite interesting, that majority of the species, more than 50% of the species, are found in less than 10% of the squares in Europe. So, in other words, the being common species, being widespread species, is very rare. So most of the species are not distributed widely. They are confined to the certain areas, like the aquatic warbler, one of the globally threatened species, which distribution is confined to the eastern parts of Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and we have some few spots at the borders with Poland and Germany. The species is still declining, or the Citrial Finch, which is confined to the mountain areas of the southwest Europe. And this is important message for the countries in Europe, because nearly every country, regardless if it's small or big, has an important population of some species, the important population for the whole Europe. So every country has its own responsibility for protection of the European bird species, and that's important message from the Atlas. I said several times that we've produced the modeled maps of the probability of distribution, and this is the example of how this kind of map can look like. So it's at very fine scale, at least to the continental level. So it's a scale of 10 by 10 kilometers. And the map shows the probability of occurrence from 0 to 1 of the species. It's based on the systematically collected data, allowing for adjustment for detection probability, and using sophisticated, complicated models. It shows the hotspots of the occurrence of the species. Sometimes these maps are misinterpreted as maps of the abundance. This probability of occurrence very often correlates with abundance, but not always, so it has to be kept in mind. But in this case of the turtle dove, which is nowadays red-listed species in Europe because of the steep decline and because of the hunting in Mediterranean and the problems in the wintering grounds in Africa, but mainly the problems at the breeding grounds in Europe, this species has already internationally agreed species action plan. And this map shows and helps this action plan to focus on the areas, on the hotspots of the species occurrence. It helps even the individual countries to set up the priority intervention areas for any kind of interventions they can make on behalf of the species. And this map has been already provided to the policy people at the European level even before the Atlas was published, because we knew it's badly needed. So this is another example of how the Atlas outputs can help the nature conservation and the policy. So in total, at the end, we've produced more than 1,500 maps at 50 by 50. Not all of them are in the Atlas, but they will be all available in the online version of the Atlas, which will be available by the end of this year. But apart of the single species maps, we can also, and we've produced the multi-species maps. Basically, the darker the color is, the more species in that particular square is. So, which can show us what are the hotspot areas or the highest species richness areas for forest species, for example, or farmland species, or other groups of species, whatever we select. That's quite important to know also for the policy purposes. For example, that the highest species richness of the farmland birds lies in the southern Europe. Of course, it's logical, evolutionary. These birds were coming from these open spaces in Mediterranean and southern Europe, and they went up to the north when the landscape was changed by the agriculture. So now we are coming to the comparison of first Atlas and the second Atlas. We have some extinctions and some colonizations of the species. I must admit that these are usually the species, the extinct species, whereas the species which basically even in the first atlas occurred in very, very local scale at the edge of their global distribution. So there are not big changes at this global point of view. Also, the big graph shows that we have some 40% of species which didn't change their distribution, not at all, between first and second atlas. And even more species increased their distribution to compare to the species which lost their distribution. But we have to be careful in interpreting this picture, because documenting colonization is much easier than documenting extinction. So that has to be really taken into account when we say, well, we have nearly balance of species which increase their distribution and lost their distribution. And what's perhaps more important is that we have to look at the details, because some of the species lost their distribution more than the others. I spoke already in part about the PEBMS, about the problem of farmland birds, and this ortholan bunting documents the troubles we are facing with farmland birds, also with the distribution data. And when you imagine the distribution changes is more robust, more conservative, let's say, than the changes in the population abundance. And even here at the distribution, we can see contraction of the range of ortholan bunting, for example, but we can see contraction of the range of other farmland species. Well, the great bustard is a quite famous example, disappearing from many parts of Europe, but also formerly very common species like a crested lark. Especially here in Czechia, the crested lark was mentioned by the older generation of ornithologists as one of the most common species, even in the cities everywhere. Nowadays, it's the species we enjoy very much. We see it once per long time. So this is really the change we can see even on our eyes. And this is, again, documenting the troubles we have with farmland birds in Europe. On the other hand, the atlas data documents some success stories of the species conservation. The white-tailed seagull has been a subject of the persecution for decades and centuries, and thanks to the legal protection, the species really regain a lot of its change. So I think I owe you the explanation of the change map. Basically, the blue color means that square was newly colonized to compare to the situation 30 years ago, and the orange color means that the species went extinct from that square to compare to the situation 30 years ago, and the gray is there was no change. So basically, the more blue the map is, the more success, the more colonization happened in case of the species. So I may go back to these farmland species. We see they disappeared from substantial parts of their range, while the wild-tailed seagull is the opposite. It gained the range, and nowadays it's quite, let's say, common, if we can say common in case of these predatory species. So this is also the way the atlas is helping us to understand the changes. But of course, the obvious question is whether there is any general geographic pattern in the changes in the bird distribution. And when we've calculated the average change in the distribution, we found that at average, the species ranges shifted northwards by 28 kilometers, so in principle by 1 kilometer a year during the last 30 years. So basically the species are moving north. We can see it at the common quail, or in case of of the species which are breeding in the north, which were breeding in the north already, they disappear from the southern parts of their range, even if it's in the north. So basically, they don't have the opportunity to move their range northwards because there is just a sea there. That's the case of the red-necked phalarope. So we apparently can blame the climate change, and the climate change is the obvious reason we can suspect. And this is what we are going to explore a bit more. But what's also worth of mentioning that this is not a universal pattern. We have plenty of species which go in completely different directions, completely against the expectations of the general pattern of moving north. And this is what we have to explore a bit more. So we have many species which are really following that expected pattern moving north, but we have some species which are doing the opposite, and we don't know yet why. What's the reason? And that's the nice thing of exploring the data from bird monitoring and atlasing, because you have really diverse situation worth of exploring and understanding better. And this also documents that we don't understand yet properly everything what's going on around us with the birds. And I mentioned already non-native species at the beginning of the part about the EBA2. We have every 10th species in Europe now is a non-native, and the atlas documents how they are spreading. This is the right-hand map is about the change of number of non-native species to compare to the situation 30 years ago. We clearly see they are increasing mostly in Western Europe, partly in Southern Europe, and they are going north and east. So we expect perhaps more non-native species going to the north and east. And the centers of spreading in the Western Europe is partly because of the climate, because the winters are milder there, so many non-native survive better there, and it's partly linked also to the habit of keeping birds in captivity, and they are escaping or they are released deliberately by the people. So these are the centers of spreading the non-native species to Europe. So I have to acknowledge a lot of people. I mentioned the field workers and the national coordinators, authors, artists, photographers, donors. I think I didn't mention enough the donors because a part of that big MAVA support from the MAVA Foundation, which was used to support the atlasing in Eastern Europe, we didn't get any big grant from the international bodies. So we mostly collected funding for this project sometimes from the governments, especially Swiss government was very helpful, but mostly we've collected support from the small donors using the species sponsoring scheme. So online, anybody could select and support the publication or the atlas work of the species using the species sponsorship. And this really helped us quite a lot. So we have PEBMS running. It's running. We produce the outputs. We support the policy people and the research with the data. European Atlas is almost over. Almost, because, as I said, we are preparing the online version of the Atlas, which should be available by the end of this year. So what next? So in principle, in case of the Atlas, we've published the Atlas, but we still see it as just the beginning, because Atlas is there. But what's important, we have a big database of the data, and we want the data is used by the researchers, by the policymakers. So that's why we are preparing the online version where even the data will be possible to access. Well, part of the data will be open access, part of the data will have to be requested and approved depending on what type of the data. But in principle, this is what we aim. The data is used and is used as much as possible because it's out of our capacity to use all the potential the Atlas data has. Then our priority, which is partly output of the Atlas activities, especially in Eastern Europe, is to support new monitoring schemes in Europe. You may mention that when I show the map with monitoring schemes contributing to PEBMS, there were a lot of countries in Eastern Europe which don't contribute yet. That's because, again, because of the capacity reasons, because of the lower tradition of the voluntary contribution to the ornithology, less wealthy economic situation, infrastructure, and so on. But thanks to the Atlas, people there became very enthusiastic about monitoring, about further monitoring, and they keep saying, "Okay, we've finished the Atlas. The Atlas is over. What next?" So that's our obligation to support them and to help them. So that's our priority now, to develop and to help to develop the monitoring schemes in Southern and Eastern Europe. Another emerging issue where EBCC is engaged is online recording portals. Nowadays, it's quite easy for everybody to share, to record their sightings of birds and to share them with the others using these online portals. And also using the information from monitoring and from online portals, we started considering making live atlas, which would be another big step forward to, at least for selected species, to show the distribution and distribution changes in nearly real time, But this is really consideration, very early phases of the planning. So we may see after some years where we go. I just wanted to mention the development of the monitoring schemes. We just started this year with the pilot scheme in Serbia, and our Serbian colleagues, even in small numbers, they are doing a great job, and with very little funding, we managed to secure for the scheme. They started common bird monitoring in Serbia using randomized selection of the sampling plots, the methods we've agreed together. So we are step by step, we are trying to develop the schemes in these type of the countries. And I mentioned the online portals. This is potential topic for the specific talk, but the online portals, they really mimic the diverse situation in monitoring in Europe. To compare to, for example, United States, we don't have one online portal. We have tens of portals in national languages. Of course, the big portals like BirdTrack or eBird are present in Europe as well, but there are many national portals. So the initiative called Eurobird Portal, under the umbrella of EBCC, is aiming to stream the information flow from these national portals into the one output, again based on the overall standard, and to produce the outputs like these maps of occurrence of species in Europe. So nowadays you can already find at the eurobirdportal.org, you can find the maps of occurrence of selected more than 100 species in nearly real time, which compiles the data from few tens of national online portals. And this is another way of exploring, not only allowing people to share their observations, because that's often the main motivation, but also making the best use of this data, for example, for the live atlas idea. But that's for the future. So finally, I have to thank for your attention, and to all the EBCC partners and colleagues. These are not all. This is just a picture from one of the workshops we had in the past in Czechia, in this case. So without this excellent network of the people, enthusiastic people, we hardly could achieve this in this very diverse European environment. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that really wonderful and very thorough presentation. It's incredible what has taken place in terms of the creation of that European map and the process of creating it. It seems like an extraordinary undertaking, and it's still evolving itself from what you've said. So it'll be exciting to see what it develops itself into. But now I want to move on to the next part. But before I do, I just also wanted to say hello, because we have another special watcher today from the Czech Republic. We have Zdeněk Vermuzek. Don't worry, you don't have to say anything, Zdeněk. I just know that you're there. And he is actually the director of CSO, the Czech Society for Ornithology. They've been good friends of us here at TWBF for the last few years. So we're very happy to go ahead and welcome you guys today to join us for this session. Don't worry, Zdeněk, we'll have you in the photo with us at the end, okay? So just prepare your smile. It's enough. Yeah. And so now for the next part, we want to delve a little bit further into our topic here. And so we actually have a guest moderator from Taiwan who will talk with Peter a bit more about his topic of discussion, the creation of the bird monitoring portal and map. And so that person's name is Jerome Chiaden Ko. He is an assistant researcher at TESRI, the Taiwan Endemic Species Research Institute, and project leader of the Taiwan Biodiversity Network, which is an open data application platform for wildlife distribution data. He also serves as the data analyst for the Taiwan Breeding Bird Survey, which is Taiwan's national citizen science bird monitoring project, which had started in 2009. So we're very happy that you're able to join us today, Jerome. And so the way that this will work is that I'll hand it over to Jerome, who will ask Peter some questions. And if it's possible, Peter, if you could answer him, or if you have questions for Jerome, you can also ask him back as well. And we have about a half an hour for this session, for this discussion session. And I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, though, please put them in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen, so that way we could bring them up after this discussion portion. So, that being said, Jerome, take it away.
Okay. All right. Okay, so thank you, Scott, and hi, Peter. We've just said hello in the start, but yeah, so it's...
Hi, Jerome.
Yeah, hi there. Okay, so that's a very interesting talk, and the works that have been done by EBBA, the second phase, is really very makes me feel exciting. And probably most of all is that I really admire that you can do this work with so many people together, that it's a massive collaboration across the national borders of, you said, 48 countries. It's something very hard to imagine, maybe in the East Asian region. I'm not sure if I'm proper to say this, but anyway, and also like in the project, it's not only including surveyors, national coordinators, and the data analysis. You also achieved the final product with so many text authors and even a lot of artists. So that really makes me would like to know how other countries or other regions can do similar things like this. And so I would maybe just introduce a little bit more about the situation in Taiwan, but for me, I'll start from the Taiwan Breeding Bird Survey, I think. So this is more like a site-based survey. It's more like the things like you said, I think in the EBCC, the Pan-European that kind of survey. And it started since 2009. So it's just around 12 years to now. And that is probably now the most long-held monitoring project in Taiwan. And so others, but since then, there are others coming up. In the same year, there's another that focused on bird ringing, the MAPS Taiwan, and in 2014 there comes the New Year bird count that focuses on winter birds, but these are all like site-based, or just it's not an atlas thing, and we've been starting. One thing is I'm curious why, like in Europe, you seems to have started the atlas more earlier in some places than the site-based project, and but in Taiwan it's like we started the site-based first. So, but now we're looking at the probability to do this. But before we do that, I would like to know what do you think is the main difference of the impact on conservation from projects like site-based breeding bird survey or like an atlas, like a whole coverage atlas project? Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's a really difficult question, because it really depends what are the problems. I really tend to say that both are equally important. I mean, having the information about the distribution and the abundance, because in case of the atlas, you collect the information about the abundance as well. Of course, it's often expert judgment for the squares, but still it's better than nothing. And with the monitoring the abundance, site-based monitoring, when you for example, use that data for the national population trends, that's also important. We've seen that the atlas, the changes in the distribution may lag behind the changes in the populations. So when you detect negative change in the distribution, it may be too late because the changes at the abundance level are already happening and you don't see them, because as I said, detecting extinction is a bit more difficult than detecting the colonization for example, at the square level. And let's imagine you have the square with formerly very common species, which is declining dramatically, but the species is still there. So at the change of the distribution, we don't see any change. The species is still present, because every single bear means the species is present in the square. While when you have the abundance data from surveys, from counts, you really see something is going on. So these complement, and on the other hand, atlas and the distribution information can show you the shifts in the distribution. And these are also important, and you hardly achieve this by the monitoring at the site level, unless you have really thousands and thousands of sites. I mean, the really big number of the sites. And I think what we have to keep in mind that at least here in Europe, the atlas field work and basically the atlas work is perhaps a bit easier than the monitoring. When you go to the skills you need from the field workers, when the field workers have to do the counts, they should be really very, very good in the bird identification in the field. For the atlas, of course, they have to determine the species properly as well, but every person, even recognizing one single species, can contribute. So we have a very good experience with the programs counting white storks. White stork is easily recognized. Everybody, the school children, recognize them. And the information can be used even for the scientific purposes, because there is a very low chance of misinterpretation. So for the atlas, you can use this kind of people who are not excellent in all the aspects of field identification of the birds. And the methods is also not so complicated, usually the field method. The other important thing is that usually you do the atlas for the certain period, usually several years, like 3, 4, 5 years. And then the people can take a rest, let's say. While for the monitoring, you ask them to do it all the time.
Every year.
Every year, unless they die.
Yeah.
So for some people, this may be discouraging. This kind of being, let's say, obligatory. Of course, it's voluntary. It's not obligatory. And we have to cope with missing values in the monitoring, and this is what we do. But what I'm trying to say is that in many aspects, the atlas is a bit easier. And this is what was proved in Europe. We have a difficulty to establish long-term, large-scale monitoring schemes in countries where we have less people, less infrastructure, and so on. But that was easier to do the atlas. And why now, when the people got enthusiastic about the atlas, perhaps it's time to start with the site level monitoring. But this may be different in different regions. So I'm not saying this is the universal approach. Definitely not. This is just what proved to be useful in Europe. Yeah, I think both. We need, for the conservation, we need both. We need atlases and we need the monitoring.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, that is a very good, I think that is a very important point to raise, that that probably doing the atlas survey is in some way more easier, and that means we could recruit more volunteers to do things because it's covered such a huge area. So that actually also brings me to another thing that I'm curious, is that a 50-kilometer square is quite large, especially in regions if the elevation range is like, or the habitat changes so much. And so like in Taiwan, we are not very large. We just have about half the size, I think, same as the Netherlands, but we have a mountain range like from 0 to 4,000, and like 60% of our main country is in the mountains. So there is actually a lot of region that you don't. One case is that a lot of region you can't reach them by road. I think not even by helicopter, because you just don't have any place to land on. And also like 50 kilometers, that kind of grid size, you can actually reach from the almost like less than 1,000 to the top, like over 3,000. So in that case, I believe there are also some places in Europe, because it's such a large region, like in the Alps or places, I think you have the same situation. So, but how do you view this? Like for a 50-kilometer grid, how do you make this kind of explanation on the breeding bird atlas is still reasonable, or how do you do some specific methods to overcome this? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. And indeed, in Europe, we have the similar cases. Like we have the countries like Switzerland with Alps, or Romania with Carpathians. Yeah. So we face the similar issues. In majority of the countries, and this is what I didn't mention in the presentation, in parallel with doing the European Atlas, the countries run their national atlas. Just some of them had it planned already before, and they simply had it as a plan. And some of them were motivated by the plans of the European Atlas, using the synergies, and usually for the national atlas, and usually the countries which don't have which have enough field workers, they did the field work at finer scale. In many cases, they did the field work at the scale 10 by 10. And even some countries like the Netherlands, they did this field work, I think, at the scale 5 by 5. So very detailed scale. And they just, for the European Atlas, they just upscaled the data, which is not a problem for the grid. So what we've received from the national coordinators, was upscaled information, which is much more detailed at the national level. That was done in the countries where they have enough field workers. But the huge countries like Russia, European Russia, they really did the field work at the scale 50 by 50. But that was just mostly because of few field workers. So in many cases, they did the field work using the expeditions. They simply went to the squares for some time, and they did intensive search in the square. So that was the only way how to do that. So in many cases, the national atlases served as a tool to get the more detailed information at the national level, which was not necessarily used at the European level, but that was used for getting the information.
Okay. Oh, all right. So actually, in different countries, some countries have actually maybe designed finer grids, smaller grids, and maybe even in different parts of their country, they have different sizes of grids. But in any case, in the EBCC, just to
Well, usually each country used one grid. I don't recall any country which would use different grids, but everything is possible.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So okay, that gave us some inspiration about how we can do that. Probably we can also. I'm not sure because in usually we would Taiwan is actually, besides the huge elevation range in the lowlands, there's also very high heterogeneity in different habitat types. And so some cases we would just expect to do an atlas data maybe at 1 kilometer grid, which is very it's very extensive. So it's but in some cases we would only believe that would be useful. But maybe we can do that kind of scale in some places, but in the mountain areas, we could do it in larger scales. Yeah, so thanks a lot. And that also brings me to another thing that besides working on the breeding bird survey, I've now also been working on databases. So, and one thing I've been curious is about that even though these different national countries different countries do their own atlas and maybe coordinate their own data. But I think for the EBBA, every country did the same method. Is it like the same method in each grid? Is it the case?
Yeah, well, in principle, the field method was, one aim was to get as much as complete the list of the species for each square. Mm-hmm. And that was up to the national coordinators, how they instruct the field workers, whether they have a really structured, prescribed, let's say, number of visits to the squares, or just asking them, please go there and do that. This was really up to the national coordinators. And what we only asked them to record the field effort, at least to be able, at least roughly, to estimate how was the effort, how was the square covered. So at each square, so finally we've collected the information per each square with the species lists and the probability of breeding according to the Atlas code. That was really very, very key, and everybody had to record the Atlas breeding codes. And then the information we've collected was also about the quality of the coverage of the square in very simple scores like poor, okay, and perfect. This kind of 3 simple scores information to have the information about the quality of the coverage of the squares. So that was one part of the field work. So basically the presence, absence, the occurrence of the species and the breeding codes. And the other part of the field work was a bit more structured. And that was the field work which provided the data for the modeling, the probability of the distribution. And that part of the field work was done in the form of the complete species lists. So people were asked to go to the squares and do between 1 to 2 hours visits and record just the complete list of the species. And these complete species lists were used for the modeling. And together with the information about the effort, which was expressed as the duration of the visit, we recommended between 1 to 2 hours, but sometimes there were some modifications. But once we had the information about the effort, that was used in the modeling as well. So that was let's say, structured, more sophisticated type of the field work which was required, and that was that part of the field work where those 35,000 people participated. The others, those 120,000, they contributed in all these type of. So, for example, you went for holidays to some place, and you recorded few species with the breeding codes, and that was used as well.
Uh-huh. Oh, I see. So that's really a combination of different level of structured data.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and in some cases, for that structured data used for the modeling, some countries used also the site level monitoring data from the surveys, because that's basically complete species lists.
Uh-huh.
We didn't use the numbers, but we just used the species occurrence, because the key in using these complete species lists is that these lists give you information about the species which were not recorded. Because if you have just opportunistic data where people, for example, record only rarities or whatever, only water birds, whatever, you are not sure whether other bird species were present and people didn't record them. And this is the difference to the complete species list, because in the complete species list you have all the birds detected. That's the different from all the birds present, because that's another issue. Not all the birds present in the site may be detected by the people, but this is the other issue. So that more structured field work was done by less people, because that was a bit more demanding, because they had to do this complete species list. So that requires already some better knowledge of bird determination, and also a bit more dedication, because they had to do ideally repeated visits to the squares. So that was a bit more demanding.
Okay.
So
thanks a lot.
Jerome, we're running a little bit late. I was just wondering if you have maybe one more question to ask Peter. Do you have do you have one more question that you'd like to ask him?
Yeah, actually I have a lot, but I don't think I should. I know. Time. So, but just maybe one thing more is like, this is actually a very long period of time. And I noticed that it seems like you started since 2010. And I've noticed that in the timetable, it seems like the main financial support came in the middle. It's like you don't get the financial support at start. You actually achieve the main financial support in the middle. And that puts me in the curiosity that, was this financial? How did you get this kind of financial support in the middle of such an action? And is it very critical of this financial support to the success of this project? Because it seems like in the first, probably you don't really. You maybe even try to do it if you don't have other kind of financial support. Yeah, just one more last question from me.
Yes, indeed. When we started, we didn't have we have nothing. So I perfectly remember my first initial discussions whether to be engaged in the European Atlas with Sergi Arando from Catalan Ornithological Institute, and we've discussed a lot of difficulties, and one of them the financial support, which was non-existent at that time, and we both said, okay, this looks like a mission impossible, let's do that. So so we started with very little, like our institution supported us a little bit, and we had a small amount of money here and there, like really very small contributions from, for example, research cooperation, from PEBMS, and this kind, really very little, and some institutional support, mainly from the Swiss Ornithological Institute. And we started with that, and using the capacity we had, thanks to that very minor financial support we had at the very beginning, we searched for the funding. And what was critical to have this big funding from our foundation in the middle, because that allowed us to support the countries which were not in the good position, in the financial position to do the field work. And that was, from that sense, that was extremely critical. I'm sure without that support, we hardly would have achieved that good coverage in Eastern Europe.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. I think I should return my time back to the audience. So thank you again.
Okay. So, all right. Thank you very much, Jerome, for those wonderful questions and this great discussion. And I do hope that, today is just the beginning of the conversation, so that maybe we could ask Peter more questions in the future.
Yeah. That would be very great.
And so we're gonna start now with the question and answer session for you, Peter. And so these are questions from the audience that we've been taking over the course of the session. The first question is that when the research data was recognized by the government and used in the implementation of public conservation policies, did you feel that any additional impetus, such as public awareness or promoting public movement to confront the problems? And did you feel like the data that you had collected had the same impact inside the EU as well as outside the EU? So it's a kind of a two-parter.
Yeah, I would say, of course, this is quite subjective. We don't have a proper data on that, but I sense that that making these outputs available and used, that really helped to increase the awareness of the issue of the monitoring and so on. So looking backwards, 20 years back when we started PEBMS in Europe, I remember we had the first workshop in 2003 here in Prague with the national coordinators going, and there was a kind of common complaint there that the policy people are not interested, not at all, in the outputs we are producing. And this really changed, because nowadays at the country level and at the EU level, you hardly can see any document, any meeting where the monitoring information is necessary, where the PEBMS wouldn't be mentioned. So that really is changed, but it's a long way forward to make these things really helping changes. That's we are still in the very early phases. And whether there are differences between the EU and non-EU, certainly they are. Of course, it depends country by country. We have non-EU countries like Switzerland or Norway, where they are non-EU member states. They take all these issues seriously, and their governments use the monitoring data on a routine basis. They produce their own reports, which are in principle very similar to the reports based on the EU legislation. But then we have non-EU countries which are less interested yet in the bird monitoring outputs. And the main difference between EU and non-EU countries is that the EU has a EU legislation on birds, and the member states have to report. The member states are obliged, and sometimes they they may have they may face difficulties. So still there is a principal rule of law applied in the EU. So all the member states should comply with the EU law, and if they don't, they may face difficulties. They may go to the court. So this didn't happen with the bird monitoring data, but it happened in other nature conservation issues. So the EU institutional framework makes things, let's say, a bit easier once the importance of the monitoring data is recognized at the EU level, and it happened.
Oh, that's very positive development. I remember hearing about a lot about, what was it, just a few months ago, discussing what is the common agricultural policy in Europe, and that this was I'm assuming that they probably used the data that was collected from these from the atlas and from the pan-European map, right? This information, they considered it.
Yeah, well, I was saying the positive things, but the negative is that a part of the nature legislation which we have in the EU, we have another bad guys playing the role, and then the bad guys is the common agriculture policy, and it takes time to get all these things to be used and to be really implemented. And the issue here in the EU is that one thing is what's approved at the EU level, and the other thing is what the member states in fact do and how they influence the whole thing. So in case of the common agricultural policy, we didn't manage yet, despite all the effort and all the pressure, for example, from BirdLife, to change the common agricultural policy to be greener. This is getting. I think we will get there, but still it's taking time, and sometimes the common agriculture policy at one side is doing these bad things as a byproduct, because it's not aimed to destroy the nature. It's aimed, but it does in many aspects destroy the nature. So sometimes the common agriculture policy does this bad thing in parallel with many good things which EU nature conservation law makes. But I think this happens even at the national level in other countries as well. You have different policies which are not linked completely to each other, and especially these sectoral policies, they are quite different.
No, every country has these problems, absolutely. Okay, so question number 2 for you. Can you introduce the current trends in survey methods and the difficulties in the application of citizen science data?
Well, so far, the most used and most, let's say, common methods in the survey method is either point count or line transect. We have as well the territory mapping, which is the most demanding. And if I am to say about the trends in the use of these methods, I can say that especially for the large-scale monitoring programs which aim to produce the population trends for the countries or the bigger regions, the territory mapping is a bit more difficult. It's the most precise, the most accurate, but it's most demanding. So you have to really have many people, very skilled people, many visits. So nowadays in Europe we have only, I think, 2 countries using territory mapping as a routine basis for the common bird monitoring, for this large-scale monitoring. The others use either point count or line transects. There is slight domination of the line transects among the methods used, but to be honest, well, there are differences in these 2 methods. Some of them are better in different types of the landscape. Some of them are better, for example, well, line transect is better in reducing number of double counts of the same individual, because the observer moves along the transect, so there is a lower chance there are double recordings to compare to the point counts. But the point counts has another advantages, and usually this is what we we discuss it when it comes to the decision which field method is to be used at the country level. We discuss it quite heavily with the national coordinators, but then the final decision is really on them, because they should know the situation in the country. We just present an advantage, disadvantage of each method, and at the end, for the calculation of the relative population trend, we can combine the results of both methods.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Actually, the second part of that question runs into the third question that I had for you, which was, how did you engage, or what is your experience in terms of engaging with citizens in terms of doing citizen science work, or just collecting the observation data? And in what ways do you use that data? Do you just use it in terms of recording data in terms of observations, or have you also used it in ways to go ahead and study behaviors, threats, things like this?
Well, I may start from the end. For the common bird monitoring and for the atlas, we basically use the information about the presence and the numbers. There are important some aspects of the behavior, like whether it's a territorial bird or non-territorial bird, because it makes a difference when you analyze the data. But that's all. Well, time to time, observers also record the situation, what's happening on the site. So somehow they record, for example, threats. But this is, I must admit, this is not the systematic part of the surveys. So the aim of the surveys is just to gather information about the bird populations. So and this is different, for example, from the monitoring of IBAs, so the important bird areas, because in IBAs the people who monitor the sites, they are asked specifically also to record what's happening on the site, what are the threats, and so on. This is not the case. This is not the case here. On the other hand, naturally, the observers know their sites, and these are usually first contacts when something is happening there from the nature conservation point of view. And very often they are engaged in the local activities to conserve the sites if it's necessary. But many of the sites don't need legal protections, because people count birds in all types of the landscape, all types of the habitats. Urban habitats, they count birds in quite poor agricultural landscape. So the main aim is to provide the information for the bigger scale. And now I think I forgot the first part of the questions.
So basically that was, how did you engage in finding the volunteers and finding the citizen scientists? What actions were taken in order to find the folks, and then also in order to engage with them and then keep them interested in doing the projects?
Yeah. Okay, so do we have 2 more hours?
Okay, we'll have to set up another webinar.
Yeah, this is usually when we have the meetings with the national coordinators. This is a standard part of our meetings, exchanging experience, how to engage with the volunteers, how to recruit them, and how to keep them. These are 2 things, because especially in monitoring, you need people are engaged for the long term. That makes probably things a bit different from other activities. And these are different approaches. Basically, you have to, in principle, you have to find the people who know the birds, who know the skilled volunteers. And if you don't have them enough, you have to train them. So there are excellent examples of training the people in bird identification. Here in the CSO, we've developed the program of the training, the bird identification of the people. And there is an excellent program called Bird ID, organized from Norway, which was organized for several other countries in Europe. It was based as a university training program. It's still running. They had some difficulties, but basically this kind of training the people in bird identification, that's sometimes important and sometimes really necessary. this doesn't bring the new people immediately, because as you know, training the people in bird ID, it's not a matter of 1 week. It takes time, but in the longer term, this is very often very necessary. And once you have skilled volunteers, it gets them to motivate and to recruit them. So basically, usually these are NGOs like the CSO and other organizations in other countries who have their own members. So basically the recruitment goes among the members, explaining why such monitoring scheme is important. And nowadays what's helping is usually bringing the international aspects, that the people feel and they know the little contribution from one or two sides contribute to have a really big picture at the country level and big picture at the European level. This is what the people really appreciate. And the key in all types of the keeping the people happy and involved is to provide the feedback. The ways how to provide the feedbacks are really extremely diverse. In some countries, it may work. You meet the people time to time in the pub, drink some beer and talk to each other. In other countries, the better way is to provide them with the CDs, with the bird recordings. In other countries, people receive extensive reports. This is what, for example, the Russian colleague did with the Russian atlas. From each square, they've produced extensive report, like 30 pages, in detailed description, what was done, what was found there with the pictures and so on. And all these reports were available as a PDFs on the website, so the people could read it. And that was the best feedback which worked in Russia. So there are many ways how to provide the feedback, but in general, it's extremely important to provide the feedback to the volunteers. They should know that their data is used, how it's used, and that you appreciate their work. And of course, if they have any kind of comments, suggestions, you have to listen to them.
Of course. All right. So speaking of international and Europe, has Brexit had any impact on European bird monitoring program and the funding for it?
I would say not yet. There may be some consequences. Of course, we have the consequences, the technical difficulties, because for the EU indicator, we have to work without the data from the UK. And because the UK data is very, very good, that would make some consequences for the EU index. But this is kind of technical consequence. We can cope with that. The funding at this moment, it's probably not the issue, because in case there is some UK-based funding, it still can be available. It can have consequences for the UK-based programs, because the UK partners would have a more difficult access to the EU funding. That could have difficulties. It's not said they still can apply for the EU funding, but they have to have a partner from the EU member states. So it's making things a bit more complicated. And because the community here in Europe is it's a community, and we don't really have the political things as a main issues in our mind. So the people who organized the first European Atlas, they were able to organize the European Atlas during the Iron Curtain, when Europe was divided into two blocks, with very limited communication, with very limited ways of going abroad for the people from Eastern Europe, and without internet.
Yeah.
And they managed. Okay. So I'm not so concerned about this for the monitoring. It will make things complicated a bit more. And it's indeed a shame to lose the British influence at the European level, because of the high standards of the science in the UK, we'll lose expertise and the knowledge. But in terms of the monitoring organizations, basically, we don't care, and we keep working regardless of political issues.
Okay. Well, Here's the next question that we have for you is a more species-specific question. It's that some ruffs, the species the ruff that breed in the Arctic Circle, will fly to Taiwan for the winter. Can you share anything on the monitoring status of the birds in this area of the Arctic tundra?
Oh, that's quite difficult question for me. Probably not the really Arctic tundra species. I just well, and the part of the story is that I think majority of the species migrating to the Taiwan are those birds from the Arctics in the Asian part of the Russia. Of course, there are some from the European part as well, but we have the story of the it's a yellow-breasted bunting. So Emberiza aurora. I think it doesn't go to Taiwan, but it winters.
Yellow-breasted bunting in Matsu. It's an outlying island. They might see some yellow-breasted bunting sometimes.
Yeah, but it winters in mainland. And this is the species which is really makes a concern for the conservation of the species, because it really undergone the dramatic decline everywhere. And we had them in Europe in the first European Atlas, and we have very, very few left in the second European Atlas just because of this decline.
Okay, wow. All right, and so now we have the last question for you for today. In the future, when the EBBC wants to expand to the less wealthy European countries, do you have any other strategic ideas for collaborating or working with them aside from what you have mentioned in your speech so far?
Probably not, because well, I mentioned it in kind of very general way, supporting the monitoring, but these ways of the cooperation could have many elements. When I was answering the question about the citizen scientists and how to get them, I was talking about the training in the bird identification, and that's one of the things we face in the Eastern European countries. There are not so many enthusiastic bird watchers, not so many skilled bird watchers. It has its own reasons in the past, but in case we want to increase the number of bird watchers, we have to train them. So one of the issues is basically the capacity building in helping the colleagues in Eastern Europe to organize the training and making the people interested in birds, in bird watching itself. That's the key issue. So it may include the activities in this, like training in the bird identification and engaging in the bird watching as a really very, very first step. But in the meantime, we don't want to wait decades for the moment when we will have thousands of skilled bird watchers like in the UK, because in the meantime we would lose the birds without noticing it. So in the meantime we have to work on that. So now we are considering also the approaches collecting the pieces of information from individual countries, which wouldn't be good enough for the single European figure about the numbers, but could be good enough to have a wider picture of, for example, wider region. So step by step, we are exploring still things, and this is the endless process, and getting the ideas from the people. So it's not over.
Okay. Yeah, it's just beginning, right? In many ways, it's still just beginning. Okay. No, thank you very much for answering those questions. It was really, really helpful to better understand. And here in Taiwan, we have so many different citizen science projects and also monitoring projects that we really want to be able to hear about what's going on elsewhere and how other countries are doing it. So that way we could go ahead and look at the way we do things and reflect upon. So maybe in the future, it would be great if we could go ahead and have a talk maybe about citizen science or how monitoring is done. Like you said, you might need another 2 hours in order to discuss.
And certainly here in Europe, we should learn from the others, from Taiwan. I'm sure always we can find the elements which we can learn from each other.
So yeah. So again, thank you so much. Before I give the closing remarks, we would like to take a group picture. So if we want to set it up right now, so if Chenqing would be able to go ahead and get the frames ready. And Zdenek, if you'd like to turn on your camera, please. There you go. Look at us. We're framed.
Okay.
Great.
So Chenqing, yeah.
Okay, everybody, 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay. Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Good.
All right.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Great smiles. And so now I'm just going to give the closing remarks. So once again, thank you so much, Peter, for giving your talk today. Thank you, Zdenek, for being backup today. I think we have all learned a lot about bird monitoring and conservation, and I think that now a lot of people here are thinking about these things and ways to go ahead and look at what we're doing here as in relation to what's going on there. And I would also like to remind everyone that we have another webinar coming up on November 29th. Shi Zhijing and Lin Dali will be discussing using Taiwan's National Ecological Network for bird conservation goals. Hope that you can sign up and join us for that. Again, a special thanks to the Forestry Bureau, the Taiwan Endemic Species Research Institute, our moderator, a guest speaker, Jerome Ke, our translators, Nayu Kerr and Tracy Wang, and of course, again, Dr. Petr Vorisek. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us your experiences, and we look forward to keeping in touch and working together more in the future. Have a great day and a great morning, I guess, for you. And weekend.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. Yeah.
All right, thanks. So, all right. So on that note, we'll say so long and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.